Cuba. Spain, who had long controlled Cuba, was in the middle of a Cuban insurrection, where Cubans were trying to gain their independence. The atrocities committed by Spain in Cuba would be sensationalized by the yellow press. Spanish misrule, as well as the devastating Wilson-Gorman Tariff of 1894, had damaged Cuba's sugar-based economy. Further, the Spanish were using a program called reconcentration, where the Spanish military concentrated masses of Cuban civilians in areas under their control. About 100,000 died between 1896 and 1898. President Cleveland had refused to intervene and even issued a neutrality proclamation. Pulitzer and Hearst attempted to outdo each other with their news stories. Hearst sent artist Frederick Remington to Cuba to draw sketches. When Remington reported that conditions were not bad enough to warrant hostilities, Randolph allegedly replied, "You furnish the pictures, and I'll furnish the war." Remington depicted Spanish customs officials as brutally disrobing and searching an American woman. McKinley's ascension to the presidency began even stronger rhetoric towards Spain. In autumn of 1897, McKinley came close to delivering an ultimatum to Spain that would have resulted in war. Spain, fearing war with the United States, ended reconcentration in 1897. They removed Weyler, the military leader in Cuba, and gave some autonomy to the Cubans. It appeared that war might be avoided. However, the Spanish living in Cuba rioted to protest Spain's talk of granting Cuba any type of self-government. So, the U.S. sent a battleship, the USS Maine, to Cuba in 1898. It aimed to protect and evacuate Americans if danger occurred, while also giving voice to popular distaste for Spain's reconcentration policies that had been made even less popular by yellow journalism in the United States. It was sent ostensibly as a friendly visit. Then, the Delaune letter. February 9, 1898, Hearst sensationally headlined a stolen private letter written by the Spanish minister in Washington, Dupuy de Lome, that portrayed McKinley as corrupt and indicated that Spain lacked good faith in instituting reforms in Cuba. The U.S. uproar forced Dupuy de Lome to resign before the U.S. called for his recall. The Delaune letter infuriated Americans. Then February 15, 1898, the USS Maine explodes in Cuban harbor. The explosion of the Maine would be the immediate cause of the Spanish-American War. 266 officers and men died. A Spanish investigation announced that the explosion was internal and presumably accidental. However, the yellow journalism's American version reported that the blast was caused by a mine planted by the Spanish. Americans accepted this mine view and leapt to the conclusion that the Spanish government was responsible. The yellow press helped to fuel the public fire. Americans now cried for war. Remember the Maine. To hell with Spain. Spanish-American War, 1898. That splendid little war. Spain agreed to U.S. demands: the revocation of reconcentration, an armistice with Cuban rebels. McKinley and Wall Street were not eager for war, but the yellow press forced the issue. McKinley did not want war, but was savagely criticized by men like Teddy Roosevelt. Mark Hanna and Wall Street did not want war because it might interfere with trade in Cuba. The public, prodded by the yellow press, demanded war to free the abused Cubans. Demands of preserving the Republican Party were the biggest factor in the decision for war. McKinley sends a war message to Congress on April 11, 1898. It urged armed intervention to free the oppressed Cubans, and Congress agreed. The Teller Amendment proclaimed to the world that when the U.S. had overthrown Spanish misrule, It would give the Cubans their freedom. The U.S. Army was small and weak compared to that of Spain, and the U.S. Navy was slightly less powerful than Spain. In the first major military victory of the Spanish-American War, the United States doesn't attack Cuba. Instead, we surprise the Spanish in the Philippines. Admiral Dewey becomes victorious at Manila Bay. While Secretary of War was away, the Undersecretary of War, Theodore Roosevelt, cabled Commodore George Dewey to attack Spain's Philippines in the event of war. May of 1898, Dewey's 6 warships sailed into Manila Harbor and destroyed all 10 of Spain's warships. 400 Spaniards were killed and wounded. Only 1 American died, and he died of a heat stroke. The Germans arrived with 5 warships. They were more powerful than Dewey. So Dewey threatened the German commander with war. A false story emerged that the British prevented Germans from destroying the U.S. fleet. 3 months later, American troops finally arrived and captured Manila in August. After the U.S. annexation of the Philippines, Aguinaldo would lead an insurrection against the U.S. The annexation of Hawaii in July of 1898, the U.S. used the pretense of needing Hawaii as a coaling and provisioning way station in order to send supplies and reinforcements to Dewey in the Manila Harbor. The white-dominated government in Hawaii was eager to be annexed, and so a joint resolution of annex was rushed through Congress and approved by President McKinley. However, McKinley would be out of office before it became official. The U.S. invasion of Cuba and Puerto Rico. The Spanish fleet eventually landed at a bottle-shaped Santiago harbor, where they were promptly blockaded by the more powerful American fleet. The invading American army took high ground near Santiago without any serious opposition. Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders were part of that invading army. There was heavy fighting at El Caney and San Juan Hill, where the Rough Riders charged up the hill that had already been largely won. There were 2 African American regiments that provided heavy support, about 1/4 of the invasion force. In actuality, the Rough Riders didn't take San Juan Hill. They first took Kettle Hill, under heavy casualties. July 1st, the Spanish fleet is completely destroyed. The USS Oregon used more firepower than Spain's 4 armored cruisers combined. Santiago was surrendered by Spain shortly thereafter. U.S. casualties, about 379 died in battle, but over 5,000 were dead due to disease. The U.S. Army also invades Puerto Rico. The U.S. sought to take the island before the war with Spain had ended. Most of the population regarded U.S. soldiers as liberating heroes. Spain would sign an armistice on August 12, 1898. The Treaty of Paris. In 1898, Cuba was freed from Spain. The U.S. received the Pacific island of Guam, which they had captured early in the war. The U.S. also gained Puerto Rico, the last vestige of Spain's American empire. The Philippine issue was a major dilemma in the negotiations. The U.S. took Manila the day after Spain sued for peace. The Philippines, thus, were not one of the spoils of war. So the U.S. agreed to pay Spain $20 million. McKinley's dilemma was that the valuable Philippines were larger than the British Isles, with a population of 7 million. He did not feel that the U.S. should give the islands back to Spain, especially after fighting a war to free Cuba. And, if left alone, he feared that the Philippines might fall into anarchy. He thought that the lesser of evils was to take the Philippines and leave independence for later. The debate over imperialism. The Philippines issue created a huge imperialism debate. Expansionist pressure from various groups also forced McKinley's hand. The Philippines and Hawaii were seen as necessary stepping stones to Asia, especially trade with China. Protestant missionaries were eager to convert Catholic Filipinos. Businessmen clamored for the new Philippine market, which had desirable raw materials. McKinley later was reported as saying an inner voice told him to take all the Philippines and Christianize and civilize them after he had knelt seeking divine guidance. He referred to the Filipinos as his little brown brothers. Democrats tended to be anti-imperialist, especially William Jennings Bryan. He feared that foreign issues would overshadow the much-needed reform at home. Some feared that foreign workers would lower wages at home. Others feared that American factories would be relocated overseas. The colonies would require a standing army. Farmers' sons would be in harm's way. Others feared what they called the mongrelization of America, or the mixing of races. The exploited racial minorities in America were opposed to doing the same overseas. The Anti-Imperialist League. The Anti-Imperialist League was formed to oppose McKinley's expansionism. The group included presidents of Stanford and Harvard University, philosopher William James, Mark Twain, Samuel Gompers, and Andrew Carnegie. The Filipinos wanted freedom, and annexation violated the consent of the governed, which was a philosophy in the Declaration of Independence. Annexation would entangle the U.S. politically and militarily in Asia. Expansionists and imperialists appealed to patriotism and to the glory of annexation. They played up possible trade profits. Manila might become another Hong Kong. The Philippines had an abundance of natural resources, and the U.S. should help uplift the world's power. The Senate passed a treaty on February 6, 1899, with the unexpected support of Bryan. He claimed the sooner the U.S. passed a treaty, the sooner the Filipinos would get their independence. Responsibility for the Philippines thus rested with the Republicans. The insular cases were cases that appeared before the Supreme Court concerning the extent to which constitutional rights applied to the people living in newly acquired territories. In other words, the insular cases were to decide whether or not people in American territories held the same rights as American citizens. The 1901 Supreme Court rulings said that some rights are fundamental and applied to all American territory, while other rights are procedural and should not be imposed upon those unfamiliar with American law. Congress must determine which procedural rights applied to unincorporated territories. The Constitution, in other words, does not follow the flag. The question of Cuban independence and the Platt Amendment. The U.S. military government, which was set up under General Leonard Wood, one of the Rough Riders. Major advances were achieved in government, finance, education, agriculture, and public health. Gains were made on the yellow fever epidemic by Dr. Walter Reed. The U.S. would withdraw from Cuba in 1902 in honor of the Teller Amendment. The Platt Amendment was put in place a mechanism to ensure that Cuba would not be vulnerable to foreign powers and to maintain U.S. influence in Cuban affairs. Cubans were forced to write the Platt Amendment into their own constitution in 1901. The provisions: Cuba bound itself not to impair their independence by treaty or by contracting to a debt beyond their resources, and that the U.S. might intervene with troops to restore order and to provide mutual protection. Finally, the Cubans promised to sell or lease needed coaling or naval stations in Cuba. This becomes Guantanamo Bay. Post-war nationalism after the Spanish-American War. It established America's first overseas empire, albeit modest compared to contemporary European standards. European powers accorded the U.S. more respect. The Monroe Doctrine was given a significant boost. Britain became an ally, while Germany grew more frustrated. The Philippines drew the U.S. into Asian affairs, and later proved to be a liability to defend. Alfred T. Mahan's view of the necessity of a larger navy prevailed, and the U.S. undertook a large naval buildup. The war served to further heal the rift between the North and the South, as Southerners and Northerners fought side by side in imperialist battles.